So it just is really a matter of, do you want families to be choosing into schools regardless of geography, or do we think that the geography part of this is actually important? That if you were in a community, in a neighborhood, that there's something to that.
Andy, good to have you here today. You've been doing some interesting work on the relationship between school choice and local control, and let's take a little bit of time to try to talk this through, because the arguments that you've been making aren't necessarily the ones that come first to people's minds.
Yep.
Now, Andy, in education, guys like you and me think empowering parents through school choice is a good thing.
Yes.
We frequently say that local control, giving communities control over their local schools, is a good thing.
Correct.
So the two of them together, great thing, right? We're all done, we can go home now.
We have acted like that for quite some time, that they are two peas in a pod, that maybe school choice is a little bit better because, as some people say, it's the most local of all local control. But it actually turns out that they're different things in a couple different ways, and in some ways they're actually mutually exclusive.
So let's break this down a little bit. All right, so we're saying school choice is when parents get to choose what school their child goes to.
Mm-hmm.
Local control is when communities control their schools.
Mm-hmm.
Feels, I think, to a reasonable viewer like, wait a minute, how are these different from one another?
Well, what we should probably say is that, like, to define our terms, that local control traditionally in America for the past century or so has meant a specific thing, and that is a local school district, where you have a small district. In America, the average school district has about 7 schools. More than half of them have like half that many schools, so they're quite small. There's one government provider, this district, in a local area, and it assigns kids to school based on their home address. They are neighborhood schools. So that's generally what we mean by local control. And so even with that definition, you can start to see how it gets to be a little bit different than school choice. Because if you have one provider of schools and kids are assigned to schools based on their home address, parents don't actually have choice among different providers. They don't have a choice among different types of schools. So we start to see the roots of the tension.
So, I mean, when we've talked about this as reformers who support school choice, we've long said, look, there's a problem with these local monopolies.
Yes.
With their bureaucracy. You wrote a book on this a number of years ago called The Urban School System of the Future. So now we're saying, wait a minute, these local monopoly bureaucracies actually have some stuff going for them?
That's right. It's almost like we liked them for a while, and then we realized there were these challenges, moved over to the school choice side, and now a number of us are rethinking some of that. And for good reason. As a conservative, I actually look at school districts and say, if they've been around for 100 years in the same form, that might be the indication that they could have some longstanding value. They could be scratching some societal itches we have.
Or of inertia and political domination, right?
So that's exactly right. And I think a lot of us, myself included, have looked at them and said, oh, they're just an example of political power, the establishment capturing them, and we can't get away from them. When in fact, a different conservative lens would say that they reflect the wisdom of ages. They must be doing something right. And so some of those things that they are doing right is they allow kids to go to schools with their neighbors. They allow families who live near one another to get to know each other. They allow a community to welcome new families into a community. They serve as a hub of neighborhood activity.
Well, now, school choice doesn't stop any of that from happening, does it?
No, not necessarily. And so one term we should define here, or more define, is you can have a voluntary association of like families choosing to be in a school, a new school, or you can have geographic choice. People decide to live in a certain type of area and then they're assigned to schools based on that. So it just is really a matter of, do you want families to be choosing into schools regardless of geography, or do we think that the geography part of this is actually important? That if you were in a community, in a neighborhood, that there's something to that.
So, what you're saying then is, I move into a community, I'm going to send my kid to middle school, that what we've often said is, well, we want to make it easier for the parent to find a school that matches their vision of what's right for their kid, their kid's needs. What you're now saying is there's actually another dimension that gets left out there, which is, I move into that community, there's advantages in my kid going to school with the kids who live on the block.
That's right.
Regardless of the specific match with the curriculum at the school.
That's exactly right.
So what are a couple, if we think about it, what are a couple of these benefits of going to school with the same kids who live on your block?
Well, if you and your neighbors have decided that you share a bunch of commonalities, that you have either the same culture or history or beliefs, that you've formed a voluntary association in your community, and you want your kids to associate with one another, or maybe you just like the idea that Johnny, your kid, gets to play with Mark, who's next door, and they get to go to school together. Or maybe you like the idea that the family down the street has a kid in the same school and you can share pickup duty. Or if you're going to be late from work, that they can watch your kid. Or maybe it's just this idea that your kids are not going to have to be on a bus all that long if they're both going to a school that's quite nearby. And all of this is like in this more conceptual view that these local schools, they've been around for a long time. They're democratic institutions. They reflect the community. The community has come together with the school board and decided what we want our school to be.
So, a couple of things that immediately leap out of this picture is one, people can disagree on that block. Some parents want a lot of homework
Yes.
and school uniforms. Other parents want less homework, more active learning, no uniforms.
That's right.
So one, there's a presumption in this district management that it's more one size fits all.
That's right.
And the second thing is, now can't Johnny play with his neighbors even if they go to different schools? Can't Johnny's parents work out ride sharing with parents even if they're going to a school of choice rather than the neighborhood school?
Yes to all of that. And you can start to see that the way that I've been thinking about this recently is it's not as though one of these models is exactly right and the other one is exactly wrong. What we're doing right now in this discussion is actually just putting weights on different sides of a scale. Oh, this side of school choice has some benefits, but this side of local controlled, district controlled, democratic institutions has some value too. We just need to own up that both sides of that scale have some value, have some weight on them, and start to make some choices about what policy should look like.
So does this mean that you now regard yourself as somebody more skeptical of school choice or opposed to school choice?
No, I'm still a big believer in school choice, especially in one thing we haven't really talked about is that the district model really works quite well for families who can exercise school choice by moving into an area, into a community that works quite well for them. If you don't have very much money and you can't move to Springfield because you like Kennedy Elementary School, well then actually you need a different type of school choice. So no, I'm not a skeptic of school choice, only I have a more nuanced view that the way this works out in suburbia, in rural areas, in urban areas can be quite different, and that we just should recognize that the district model has some value to it.
So Andy, let me push you a little more on the social capital point.
Mm-hmm.
So it seems to me that, look, I send my boys to a charter school or a private school or a district school. Mm-hmm. They're going to make friends.
That's right.
I'm going to meet parents when I go to the school. So that's going to be true whether or not it's a neighborhood school. So what's being lost here?
So that is absolutely right, that these voluntary associations that aren't based on geography are still valuable. People are coming together with shared views of the world, and that can be quite strong. But there is something to be said, and there's literature on this, that social capital can be geographically based, that there's something about communities coming together. So even if you are in a school of choice, you might be going to school with kids and communities that you agree with that are 20 miles away. And that's different than going to school with your buddy who goes next door. Maybe your family then can't do pickup duty for the family that lives down the street. And if you are not building those kinds of bonds between people who are close to one another, maybe you're not building the kind of trust among people. You're not bringing that geographic community together in the exact same way. Now again, to the first part of my point, you are still bringing people together in a voluntary system, a school choice, but the geographic dispersion, let's just say it's non-trivial. It matters that families together in a community are building trust.
But isn't it maybe better for families to send their kids to these diffuse networks because they're meeting kids from other neighborhoods? Maybe they're meeting families of other socioeconomic strata or other races. If kids are going to school with kids from their neighborhood, aren't they more likely to be socioeconomically similar?
Well, It's certainly possible. It could be the case, though, that school choice leads people to go to schools that are actually populated with the exact same types of kids, and it could be the case that a community is actually much more diverse. We don't know about this. It becomes a question of what do we value of the community that's coming together. Is actually the affirmative decision of a family to be there what's important? Is it the demographics of the students who are there? The point, I think, of one of the points of local control going back quite some time is that we actually believed a neighborhood, a community, people who live there getting to know one another, share a schooling experience, share this common institution is actually quite important.
So the argument here is that geography in and of itself can be a good thing.
That's right. And so the reason why you and I have been talking about this a lot is reformers, at least over the past 5 years, speak almost uniformly derisively of zip code education. That we have talked about it as though it is always bad, inherently bad, that there is a geographic component because there is racial segregation if you assign kids, and economic segregation, that if you assign kids to schools based on their home address, that is inherently bad because kids will go to school with kids like them and not somebody else. What this argument actually is saying is that's not the full story, that it actually can be quite good for kids to go to school with kids and communities and neighbors and families that are from the same area. Now we should be aware, remain cognizant of racial and economic segregation. Those things are important, but that doesn't mean that all communities are suffering from that or that zip code education is always wrong across the board.
Well, I mean, based on what you were just saying, you were talking about, especially if you live in a neighborhood and folks have similar traditions and expectations and norms. But let's think of Washington, D.C. or New York City or L.A. There's frequently patchworks of neighborhoods where
Right.
block to block people might have very different traditions and heritages. And there's a lot of schools in these places. And so it's possible for families to both pick a school and still not have a child ride a bus for a long time.
That's exactly right.
So does the argument you're making have any application when we're talking about urban areas?
It does feel that way, and this is maybe one of the reasons why urban school choice has expanded in the way that it has. So for example, there are cities now like Washington, D.C., where 50% of kids are in charter schools. In New Orleans, virtually all kids are in charter schools. That when you have dense concentration of people, and schools can be close to one another, and people can choose schools and not have their kids on buses for quite a long time, that the virtues of choice are still there, but operationalizing it is still actually is much easier than, say, in a remote rural area where there might be only one middle school in an area, 30-mile radius area. Well, if you want to have school choice there and competition and maybe close down a school, it actually works out a whole lot differently. So this is part of the nuance. We need to understand that when you operationalize some of these things, it's going to differ based on history, culture, but also the geography you're talking about.
So, when you put it that way, we think about the Trump administration, for instance, and the emphasis it has put on school choice as the centerpiece of its K-12 reform strategy. And when you put it this way, talk a little bit then about how school choice is going to play out in, say, urban coastal areas, differently, say, from a lot of the red states, which voted for Trump, but tend to be what you just talked about as less densely populated with, many more folks living in rural or thinly settled suburban communities.
Yeah, it's interesting. So imagine the president or secretary of education were to say something like, we believe in local control, we believe in school choice. What if it's the case that there's a community that says, great, local control to us actually means no school choice? We all agree that we want to come together with a local school board, a small district, where we're going to learn the same sets of materials and our kids are going to be brought together. That we believe, and this is the right way to do e pluribus unum. Whatever differences we have, we want to come together in this single government provider. There's some tension right there. What happens in an urban area if they actually make a very different decision? That it turns out to be the case that they like in a 10 square block area for there to be 20 different types of schools. And for no one to be assigned to a school, they want families to have power and for them to individually be able to choose whether they want a Montessori school, a college prep, whatever else it might be. It can play out differently in different areas. And do we believe that that's okay?
When you put it this way, I mean, it sounds like parental choice and local control are really distinctive things. But as I think about the way so much of the conversation, especially among, say, choice advocates on the right, has unfolded over the last 10, 15 years, we've really tended to treat them as one thing. Yes. Why is that?
It's a good question. I think part of the reason why is when a lot of people started talking about local control, it predated a lot of the school choice stuff we have now. You have to remember that vouchers and charters didn't really come about, especially at scale, until the early 1990s, the mid 1990s. And so that started to complicate a whole lot of these things. Both of them, in my view, at least reflect the idea that we want to be non-technocratic, non-centralized, that we want to push power down from the federal government, even from the state government, to people more local. But that's when the questions start to arise. How far down do you push power? Is it to a local democratic institution, the school board, or do you push it further down to families? And if you do it a democratic institution like a school board and they make decisions that some families don't agree with, do they have the right to opt out or not? So I think they share a lot. Let's say they share 90% of the DNA, but that last 10% where they differ is really quite important. And this is where policy matters the most.
I mean, as I hear you, as I listen to you, I mean, one thing that strikes me is push comes to shove. If I'm going to give somebody the control of a child's education, I think I'm going to traditionally prefer the parents over a local administrators and education officials. Push comes to shove, I think there's a natural leeriness of the way these district providers have played out the performance they've done over time. And when we talk about families in a community or block want what they want, I think a lot of us are also aware that that kind of moting oneself off, trying to protect what we've got, seems to have created some of the inequities that reformers are so frequently trying to address. So are there tensions here, but it's the folks who are fighting for choice who are really at the end of the day on the side of the angels?
Sometimes they absolutely are. It can be the case no matter, so all of the good things I said about the district model, we have to also recognize that those virtues can turn into vices. So although there are lots of good things about local democratic control and owning your community schools and assigning kids to school if you share a bunch of values, what happens if that one government provider is lousy? What happens if that school to which your kid is assigned is no good and is often unsafe? So choice advocates who've been fighting against that, often they are trying to they're trying to be in the best interest of low-income kids, especially in cities. But it's also the case that a community can come together and decide if we just empower families individually, that's not the path to empowerment necessarily, that's the path to atomization, that we're all going our separate ways. And actually what mediating institutions, democratic institutions actually do is they help give communities and families meaning by bringing people together, that this is the heart of social capital. You bring different people together, they develop trust, and they build strong communities. And that can happen through not just choice, but through these institutions we've had for a century.
So, if you're trying to sit down and get a choice advocate to say, wait a minute, so there is some value in these districts. So when you talk about social trust, social capital, make this concrete. What are a couple of the things that popular charter schools or popular private schools that families choose to attend, they attend with their neighbors? What are the things that these can't do that these local school bureaucracies are able to do?
Well, some people would say that they, just by nature of being choice-based, they're already adding an element that cuts against some of the things that some people want in society. They're allowing people to separate themselves into communities, and that necessarily leads to some haves and some have-nots. I don't always agree with that, but there is an equity argument that the only way that you get a truly just system of schools is the progressives from back in the day would have said that's why we have PS1, PS2, PS3.
Do you believe that?
No, I don't necessarily believe that.
So give me an argument that you could actually think would be convince a choice advocate that there's some virtue in these.
In the system of
in the system of local systems.
Yeah, that when you have a small democratic community that comes together in a small unit and has a school board election, that they are having a discussion, deliberative democracy of deciding what as a community they want for all of their kids, and they are going to do the best for all of their kids and serve everybody quite well. But it's not just what I want with my family, it's what we as a community want. This is communitarianism, this is small-scale democracy.
But we know that school board elections frequently get dominated by teachers associations and other system employees.
They can be. And I think that what we've seen, especially over the past couple decades, is a lot of people interpret what happens in big cities that have 100, 200, 500 schools being reflective of all school systems, and that's not the case. Often these small school systems that have 4 schools and a couple hundred students and a couple dozen teachers maybe, it's really quite different. That what a lot of people view as a big school system that is impersonal, sclerotic, bureaucratic, a lot of families, like 2/3 of families that give their local schools an A or B, actually view their school system as their family, their community. It's us, it's not them. That they think that there's a lot of value in that. And they think that people who are doing school choice are actually trying to fight against this fabric of the community.
So given all this, are there implications for policymakers, for folks out there trying to think about the right way to create school choice or to drive educational change?
Yeah, I think so. So one of them is a book that I think both you and I like, Politics, Markets, and America's Schools, became famous or infamous for making this case that choice is a panacea. I like to think that choice is priceless but not costless. It is invaluable, but you also recognize that there are some costs to it, that it has more weight on its side of the scale, but that doesn't mean the other side is empty. And so when we say choice is great, okay, what does that mean in the remote rural community? What does that mean in the suburban community where all of the families give their schools an A, that they're actually quite happy with it? They would actually view a choice program as being disruptive. And maybe what they like about their system the most is it's reliable, it's trustworthy, it's stable, it's been there for quite some time.
So if a governor in one of the Dakotas or Oklahoma calls you up and says, Andy, all right, interesting argument. Give me a couple of takeaways as far as actual concrete policy. Any thoughts?
Yeah, for sure. So there are examples of rural charter schools that have done quite well, and rural and charter laws ought to be written in such a way that they allow rural communities to use them to save schools, to give more flexibility. It might be the case that in a certain number of communities where there is dense enough population that a couple new schools could actually do quite well, but it also might be the case that a law on vouchers that works quite well in Washington, D.C. would not work so well in Wyoming or in Alaska, where there isn't density of population, where there isn't the same history of school options available to them. So I continue to be as vociferous an advocate of school choice as you could find probably, but it's just recognizing that it has values, but we have to apply it in different communities in different ways. And that just, I think, means being more sophisticated, more nuanced in the way that we do it.
Appreciate it, my friend.
Thanks for working with me on this. This has been a really interesting set of issues, I think.
Thanks for taking the time.
Really appreciate it.
Hey, everyone. That's the end of our discussion with Andy Smarick. Thanks for watching. As always, let us know what other topics you'd like AEI scholars to cover on Viewpoint. And to learn more about localism or school choice, check the links in the description below.